Hello everyone. Just a quick video to try and talk you through some of the difficulties you might be having with your reflective projects. Hopefully by now you're well underway to handing in your first draft, but I know for some of you there's still some things you're a little bit unsure of. So this isn't really anything new, it's just compiling everything into one place to hopefully give you a bit of a better understanding of what's being looked for. I think it's important for me to say that there's no one format to this. There's no one way of writing these projects. Each one of your projects is going to look different. So I can't suggest the sorts of paragraphs you might write. I can't suggest the sorts of sentence starters you might use because obviously they're going to be so different. But as long as you've got a clear idea of what's being asked of you, I think you should then be able to piece this together a bit more carefully. Right, so having a look at the first part, the research stage. I mean, obviously, we should all be well underway with this part. We should have completed this even by now. But just to remind you, really, some of you have asked me how many sources you should be looking at. I think 10 would be the minimum I would aim for, probably. Looking at some of the exemplar ones from IB, some of the ones that have achieved an A grade, they've used at least 10 sources, if not more. I mean, I've seen some that have used about 30 sources, so there's no real limit on this, but I'd certainly say 10 is the minimum. Of course, they should all be academic. You know, it shouldn't be someone who's just written a blog post or someone who's posted something on Snapchat. It's got to be something academic from articles, books, newspapers, etc. And it should all be arranged in a particular way, you know, not just listing what you've found, but what are the common themes to the research that you found? Are there some that present an argument for the dilemma, against the dilemma? Are there some that refer to cultural differences? Are there some that refer to different religious arguments? Obviously, you'll know more about that than I do from what you've read, but there should be a way in which you can organise your research into some particular paragraphs that you can then write about. So those examples that are on the P drive, you should all be looking at those and coming back to those and looking at the best ones. The example about smacking is a good one that's on the P drive in the exemplar folder. There's some very, very good ones in there as well, though. Examples 10 and 20, for example, they're top grade answers. What do they have in common? Well, they all have an introduction explaining clearly the different arguments that are going to be presented in this project. So just a very brief overview about arguments for, arguments against, some context into the issue that you're looking at. So for example, if you're doing criminology and you're looking at the ethical dilemma of the ways in which prisoners are treated, for example, then obviously your introduction needs to be focused around, well, why is that an issue? Why are you looking at it? Why have you felt that that's important? How does it link to your career-related subject? And what are the arguments actually around this topic? What is the ethical dilemma at the heart of it? And that's what your introduction needs to be focused on. What is the ethical dilemma that you are looking at, not the topic that you are looking at? So if you're doing criminology, yes, of course, the topic is important, but actually what is the issue of right or wrong at the heart of that topic? What is the ethical dilemma? Okay, so there's criterias A to E, which I'll just run through very quickly. You can see that they're allocated different marks. By all means, stop this, pause this, and take time to read this through properly. I'm just going to skim through it. Criteria A, I've highlighted the bits in yellow that I think are most important. So as you can see, the ethical dilemma is embedded in an issue. So don't just talk about what the topic is. Don't just talk about the issue of the way prisoners are treated, or the role of transgender athletes in sport, or the role of nudity in art. Just give some examples of ones that you're all doing. What is the ethical dilemma? You know, what are the rights and wrongs of the arguments related to that topic? What are the different perspectives? Why is it an ethical dilemma? What are the different arguments related to that issue? And then you can see it says at the bottom, a variety of sources, understanding bias and validity. So really important that in order to get top grade in this, not only are you carefully selecting the material you use, but actually you're explaining why is it that you've chosen one thing over another. So for example, you might have found a great blog or a great Wikipedia page on something, but you might be questioning the validity of it. How true is it, in other words? Can it be trusted? If you felt like that's not the case and you haven't selected something because of that, put that into your writing. You know, say why you've chosen this source that you are writing about and quoting, and why you haven't used other things. Why do you trust the sources that you have used in your project? What makes them trustworthy? What makes them academic pieces of writing? The top grades for this project will have something of that in their writing. These are the grade descriptors. So actually when you're being allocated a grade for each of these criteria, this is what the examiner will look at. So again, I'm not going to read through all of that, but you can see at the bottom, that's really what you're looking for. 5 to 6 marks, hopefully we'll want to achieve that top band. And you can see use of sources is a key part of that. Okay, criteria B, knowledge and understanding in context. So have you made reference to how this issue, this dilemma, has a local or global example related to it? That should be fairly straightforward for all of you. We should be able to show what impact this has in our country and or in other countries as well. So if it's the issue of, I'll talk about criminology because most of you are doing that. If it's the issue of how well criminals are treated, do they deserve to be well treated in prison, then are you looking at the treatment of prisoners in America, the treatment of prisoners in the UK? Why is this becoming an issue of study? Why is this an important issue for you to look at? You can see for that 9 marks allocated to this. So it's really important that the ethical dilemma you're talking about, so you know, the rights and wrongs of treating prisoners humanely, that there is an example of that in your project, because there's a lot of marks at stake for that point. Alternative perspectives as well, you can see makes up the 9 marks. So do you have different viewpoints? Do you have arguments for and against? Do you have different cultural arguments, different religious arguments? All of that feeds into that 9 marks. Again, you can pause here and have a look at exactly what you are being graded on for that 7 to 9 marks. For criteria C, 12 marks. This is the biggest part. Can you evaluate the material you're looking at? So have you arranged it into a logical order with different themes? Have you talked about the strength of the arguments that you're presenting? Do you agree with them? It says here there needs to be some personal voice. What do you make of the arguments? Do you agree with them? If not, why not? If you do, why? Constantly got to being able to talk about not just what the argument is that you found in, say, a journal article, but what do you think of the strength of the argument? Do you agree or do you disagree, and why? That's the most important thing in this project, that you are discussing the strengths and weaknesses of the arguments that you have found. And as you can see there, it says, as I've just mentioned, drawing upon evidence, talking about the strengths, limitations of those arguments, and importantly, conclusions are made. So what do you think? But also, there should be a conclusion at the end of your project as well, summing up your thoughts and feelings about this dilemma, about the strengths of arguments, and actually which side of the debate are you now finding yourself on. Okay, criteria D, this is very straightforward, 3 marks. How have you laid out your project? So as long as it's well written, as long as the paragraphs are structured properly with a theme emerging in each paragraph, is this part the arguments for? Is this part the arguments against? Is this part of the introduction? It should all be well laid out, well signposted with titles. Other than that, there should be 3 easy marks. Proofread as well, I would add. Make sure you don't just write something and hand it in to me. read through it first, make sure it makes sense, make sure all of the subtopics are in there, the headings are in there, and that's what's going to get your 3 marks criteria D. Okay, finally, criteria E. The bits in yellow are the most important bit, but really criteria E refers to your RPPF forms, the reflection forms. This is about the research process. So this should be 6 easy marks for the reflection process. If you read through what I've got here from IB, you can see engage in discussions with planning of the research, evaluating the decisions you've made. So why did you do some things or others? Why did you change your mind about your question? Why did you use some parts of the research and not others? And student voice is present as well. So don't just write down what I've told you to write. In your own words, what have you found successful about this project? What difficulties have you had with this project? What difficulties have you had with your question? What changes have you made? How easy has it been to find sources for the material you wanted? What problems have you had with finding academic sources, trustworthy, valid sources? Have you found that a lot of the sources are biased? Are they presenting arguments in a particular way? All of that should go into your reflection form. So you're constantly evaluating the research process in that form. And as you probably remember, there should be 3 entries to that based on our initial meeting, the interval meeting that we will have once your drafts are handed in, and then your final meeting as you complete your project next year. But certainly for the end of year 12, we should have those first 2 meetings sections finished in once I've handed your drafts back to you. But 6 marks. So really, take your time with that. That should be 6 easy to achieve marks simply based on the research project you've done. So not really anything about the writing, the academic side of it. The process of doing this research is what you need to focus on in those forms. Okay, again, there's the marks. So this is what I'm going to be using when I'm marking them, these mark bands and these descriptors. So having read through those sections, really it'd be a good idea for you to go back and think about, well, have I met that criteria at the bottom? Have I met those top bands? And if not, what else needs to be added to my work? There's some helpful pointers, I think, for you for your reflection form. So in the first reflection, go back and look. Did you include all of these parts in it? In the middle one, once you've handed your draft and I've given it back to you, that's the sort of question that you need to be answering, those questions there, and addressing the challenges you now have. Now you've given your draft in, what challenges have you had in now developing a second draft? What setbacks have you had? What changes have you had to make, etc.? And that's for you later on to have a look back over your final reflections next year. Finally, just some questions to leave you with, really. You need to ensure that you've answered all of these and thought about them carefully. So have you actually answered the question? That's really important. Your question isn't just there as a title. All the way through your project, have you answered a question? And in your conclusion, have you answered that question? Obviously, there's no definitive answer, but have you tried to give an answer? Your opinion should be there all the way throughout. Make sure you focus on the ethical dilemma and not just the topic. So what are the rights and wrongs of this issue? Bibliographies, check that they're done in Harvard style, please, and that you have completed them in alphabetical order. The Harvard guide is on the P drive, but I'll send out a link to it again just so that you've got that. And just check through this presentation, check through the mark schemes that are on the P drive. And really, as long as you know what you're being marked on, you should find it fairly straightforward, I think, to be able to go over your projects and just check, have I got all those pieces in place? Okay, any more questions, obviously get in contact with me, but hopefully that will help you if you are still struggling with writing this first draft.